Order. There are now 2 minutes of debate, equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 711, offered by the senator from California, Mrs. Feinstein.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I have watched these votes,
order.
And I must say I view them with substantial dismay at the lack of courage in this House. Courage to stand up and say we've had enough of these killings. We've had enough of the development of highly militarized kinds of weapons.
It's not in order.
Senator from California.
We have had enough of the development of highly militarized weapons, easy to shoot, big clips, 100+ bullets in each, large velocity guns falling into the hands of grievance killers, juveniles, people mentally disturbed. There will be no background checks, apparently, and we have a proliferation of these weapons. I have a hard time understanding it. We're here on 6-year terms for a reason, to take votes on difficult issues. Everything needs 60 votes today. This is supposed to be a majority body. We have crafted an assault weapons bill to really represent the people of America. Every single poll has shown support.
Senator's time has expired.
Let me just end. I know how this is going to end, and the despair and the dismay of families standing out there whose safety we need to protect, and we don't do it. I am really chagrined and concerned. If anybody cares, vote at least to prospectively ban the manufacture, the sale, the importation of military-style assault weapons. Show some guts. Thank you.
Mr. President, I strongly oppose this amendment. This would result in the largest ban of guns in the history of our republic. 3 studies that the Justice Department sponsored during the previous ban found no evidence that it was effective in reducing multiple victim shootings or wounds per victim. It did not stop Columbine. It would not stop Newtown. The ban does not apply to existing weapons such as those used at Newtown. And criminals who would steal such guns would not care the least if they were banned. We never received an opinion from the Justice Department that such a ban would satisfy the Second Amendment. I surmise that they're not able to conclude that it is constitutional. A ban on guns based on their looks when more powerful guns are exempt would not satisfy any standard of review. These guns are commonly used, in the words of the Supreme Court, for self-defense. They cannot be constitutionally banned. This is a slippery slope of compromising the Second Amendment, and you go down that road, you're going to find it easier to compromise other things in the Bill of Rights. I yield the floor.
Question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
No.
Ms. Ayotte.
No.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
Mr. Ball votes no. Tell you what's going to happen. Not only no.
Mr. Balkus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer.
Dave.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Boxer, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Cowan, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Harkin, Hirono, Kane, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Levin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Blunt, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Landrieu, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Paul, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Wicker. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye.
Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? On this vote, the yeas are 40, the nays are 60. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Yeah.
Without objection.